Hello, I'm Abby Duke, and this is my video presentation of my Communication 600 exam in Dr. Brown's class. So the first question of part 2 is briefly explain the two traditions and discuss how it shapes your scholarship. So the first tradition is the socio-psychological perspective, and that basically says that communication is a process by which individuals interact and influence each other, and that's on page 144 of Craig 1999. So it explains that behavior expresses psychological mechanisms, states, traits, and through interaction produces cognitive, emotional, and behavioral effects. And then from a socio-cultural perspective from Craig 1999, that's explained as symbolic process that produces and reproduces shared socio-cultural patterns. It explains how social order is created, realized, sustained, and transformed in micro-level interaction processes. So these two traditions shape my scholarship because I ask questions like, does social media cause narcissism? So I am asking, do interactions that we make on social media affect an individual's beliefs, thoughts, feelings, etc., from a socio-psychological perspective? And then as far as a socio-cultural perspective, for example, I have researched the relationship between income and happiness. And one thing that I discovered is, since I live in Western culture where our culture is wealthier, we celebrate wealth, we show it off, it's kind of everywhere, that my perspective of poor is a lot different from someone in Africa, in a third world country. They're not going to think that the idea of poor is going to be completely different, and that is due to different cultural upbringing. Basically, it influences how we see ourselves and how we see each other because of our cultural background. So those are just two ways that shape my scholarship. The second question is to compare and contrast how each tradition treats the nature of the self, relationships, and identities. So Littlejohn and Foss, 2011, discuss under the socio-cultural perspective the communication theory of identity, which basically says that there's a core identity, which is how you see yourself. There is a ascribed identity, which is how other people see you. And then there's a communal identity, which is how society would see you. So these ideas are kind of learned and internalized, and then they're projected. And then from a socio-psychological, there's the trait theory, which is discussed on page 80 of Littlejohn and Foss, and it says individuals have relatively consistent ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving across situations. So behavior is a combination of traits and situational circumstances. And so the difference here in identity is that sociocultural considers who you are in the eyes of society or your culture, whereas socio-psychological kind of just examines the individual's experience. And then as far as relationship, the socio-psychological, it has the relational schema in family. So you develop a schema based on what you know about relationships, what you know about family relationships, and what you know about different people, what you know about the relationships with others in your family. And then the sociocultural perspective has the identity management theory, which the example they give is is a intercultural marriage. So if I was married to a man from Bangladesh, we would constantly be negotiating who we are as a couple, and it would take into consideration the cultural differences. So are we going to be a westernized couple, or are we going to take on more of his cultural background? So and sometimes those would be different, in different situations. So again, the difference in relationships are more, the family schema considers small groups like family, and then the sociocultural considers big groups, as in who you are in the eyes of your culture or your society. So there's just the difference there. And then the third question is, discuss how the epistemological, ontological, axiological assumptions of the communicator are different between the two traditions. So I would say, from epistemological perspective, so from a socio-psychological tradition, the difference is you gain knowledge from your interactions. From a socio-psychological perspective, I am going to learn from my immediate interactions. So I'm going to learn about a person, and I'm going to make judgments about a person based on our interactions. So if I think a person is rude when I first meet them, that's a socio-psychological perspective of knowing. And from a socio-cultural, like if I see a man and woman, if a man buys a drink at the bar for a woman, I make a judgment based on my culture that says, in my culture, that this is a mating ritual, because I know that in my culture, if a man buys a woman a drink, that usually means he's romantically interested in her. So I'm making a judgment based on what my culture has told me about an interaction. That's how I come to know something or to learn something. So the difference there is just, one is an individual experience, and the other is based on the experience of the culture. Ontological, so like I said, just to reiterate, ontological is the nature of being. So from a socio-psychological perspective, the experience is primarily individual, and a socio-cultural, it's primarily social. So socio-cultural would say someone that is, a white female in Western society like myself, they would have similar experiences as me in a socio-cultural perspective. But socio-psychological would say that, my experience is different from the next person, because it basically studies the experience of the individual and those differences. And then axiological, this I think would just explain the kinds of questions that you ask. So when I ask, does social media cause narcissism, am I asking just to know how it affects the individual? Or do I want to know because I want to make a social change? I want to say, how can we use social media to project more valuable perspectives or something like that? And then so the limitations are basically just in the kinds of questions that you ask. So for example, socio-psychological isn't going to consider cultural differences, but the socio-cultural perspective is not going to consider differences like critical theory, maybe power struggles, or, it would be like social media, how social media reinforces sexist values or something like that. Those would be the limitations of each tradition. It's all in the kinds of questions you want to ask. And that is pretty much it. That is the end of my presentation, part 2. Thank you.